Throughout history, the pursuit of knowledge has driven human beings to remarkable achievements, curing diseases, splitting the atom, and mapping the stars. But that same pursuit has also led some of the brightest minds down paths so dark and so disturbing that they force us to confront a deeply uncomfortable question. At what point does science stop being noble and start becoming monstrous? Tonight, we are going to explore some of the most haunting experiments ever conducted, experiments that blurred the line between discovery and cruelty, and in some cases, erased it entirely. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. In the winter of 1939, a speech pathologist named Wendell Johnson sat in his office at the University of Iowa and contemplated a question that had consumed him for most of his adult life. Johnson stuttered. He had stuttered since childhood, and the experience had shaped not only his personality, but his entire career. He believed that stuttering wasn't something a person was born with, but rather something that was created, manufactured by the very people who were supposed to help. His theory was controversial and simple. He believed that if you told a child they were a stutterer, if you corrected them constantly, scolded them for the way they spoke, and made them painfully self-conscious about every syllable that left their mouth, the child would eventually begin to stutter for real. To prove this, Johnson needed subjects, and he needed them young. He turned to one of his graduate students, a 22-year-old woman named Mary Tudor, and together they designed an experiment that would earn a nickname so fitting it stuck for decades. Tudor drove to the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home in Davenport, a sprawling institution that housed children who had been abandoned, surrendered, or simply left behind by families who couldn't or wouldn't care for them. These were kids who had already lost everything, and now they were about to lose something else. Tudor selected 22 children, ranging in age from about 5 to 15. Some of them already stuttered. Others spoke perfectly normally. The children were then divided into 4 groups. The first group consisted of children who stuttered and were given positive encouragement. They were told their speech was fine, that they were doing well, and that they should keep talking. The second group of stutterers received the opposite treatment. They were criticized relentlessly, told their speech was getting worse, and made to feel ashamed every time they opened their mouths. The third group were the normal speakers who received praise, and then there was the fourth group, the one that would come to define the entire experiment. These were children who spoke perfectly well, who had no speech problems at all, and they were about to be told, over and over again, that something was deeply wrong with them. Tudor visited the orphanage regularly over the next several months, from January through May of 1939. Each time she sat with the children in the fourth group, she told them that their speech was not normal, that they were beginning to stutter, and that they needed to stop talking until they could do it correctly. She told them to be careful with every word. She told them people were noticing. She told them to take a breath before speaking and to start over if they made a mistake. These were children with no speech impediments whatsoever, and yet, session after session, Tudor planted the seed of doubt in their minds so deeply that some of them stopped speaking almost entirely. The effects were devastating and immediate. Children who had once been talkative and outgoing became withdrawn and silent. They shuffled their feet when asked questions. They covered their mouths. They whispered. One girl who had been described as a bright, sociable child before the experiment began was noted by teachers to have become almost unrecognizable, turning inward, refusing to participate, and flinching whenever she was asked to read aloud. Another child began inserting long pauses and repetitions into his speech, behaviors that had never been there before. He was not stuttering, not in the clinical sense, but he was doing something perhaps even more tragic. He was performing the very dysfunction he had been told he had. He was becoming what they told him he was. When the experiment ended, Tudor returned to Iowa City and presented her findings to Johnson. The results confirmed his hypothesis to a degree. The children in the fourth group had not developed true stuttering in the neurological sense, but they had developed hesitations, self-consciousness, anxiety around speaking, and deep behavioral changes that mimicked the outward appearance of a speech disorder. Johnson had proven that the power of suggestion, the cruelty of a voice telling a child they are broken, could reshape how that child interacted with the world. But the cost of that proof was staggering. Johnson never published the study. He never submitted it to a journal or presented it at a conference. The reason, it is believed, was timing. By the end of 1939, the world was watching Nazi Germany conduct experiments on prisoners, on children, on the vulnerable and the voiceless. Johnson, it seemed, understood that what he had done might not look very different. The study was buried in the university's archives, known only to a handful of colleagues who referred to it in hushed tones with a name that stuck like tar. They called it the Monster Study. But the damage didn't stay in the archives. The children grew up carrying the scars of those sessions in Davenport. Some of them struggled with speech and self-confidence for the rest of their lives. They had entered the orphanage as children who could speak just fine, and they left those sessions as children who believed something was fundamentally wrong with them, a belief that in many cases never fully went away. It wasn't until 2001 that the San Jose Mercury News published a detailed investigation into the experiment, pulling it out of the shadows for the first time. The University of Iowa issued a formal apology that same year, and in 2007, the state of Iowa settled a lawsuit brought by several of the surviving orphans and the estates of those who had already passed, paying a total of $925,000. But for many of those involved, the apology came far too late. The damage had already been done, not with scalpels or chemicals, but with words. And sometimes, that's the worst kind of all. And yet, as cruel as the Monster Study was, at least its subjects survived. Not every experiment can say the same, and the further we go back, the more we discover that some of the most disturbing work in scientific history wasn't done on human beings at all, but on animals, in ways that were so extreme they feel almost impossible to believe. And in the 1920s, one Soviet scientist decided to test the very boundaries of life and death itself. Sergei Brukhonenko was a physician working in Moscow in the early 20th century, and like many of his contemporaries, he was fascinated by a single question that had haunted medicine for centuries. What keeps us alive? More specifically, Brukhonenko wanted to know whether the brain could survive without the body, whether consciousness, or at least the appearance of it, could be maintained through mechanical means alone. To answer that question, he built a machine, a crude but functional device he called the autojektor, which was essentially the world's first heart-lung machine. It was a system of pumps, tubes, and reservoirs that could circulate blood, oxygenate it, and deliver it to tissue, all without the need for a beating heart or working lungs. The machine was rough and primitive by modern standards, but for the 1920s, it was revolutionary, and what Brukhonenko did with it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. In September of 1925, at the Third Congress of Russian Pathologists in Moscow, Brukhonenko stood before an audience of scientists, doctors, and academics and presented his work. What he showed them left the room in stunned silence. He had taken a dog, severed its head from its body, connected the head to the autojektor, and kept it alive. The head sat on a table, tubes running from the machine into the arteries of its neck, and as the audience watched, it moved. The eyes blinked. The nostrils flared. When Brukhonenko shone a light into the dog's eyes, the pupils contracted. When he tapped the table sharply with a hammer, the head flinched. And in what might be the most unsettling detail of all, when Brukhonenko placed a piece of cheese near the dog's mouth, the head attempted to eat it. When he dabbed citric acid on its nose, the head recoiled, licking its lips in an apparent attempt to get the taste away. To the observers in that room, the head appeared to be not just alive, but aware. The demonstration lasted approximately 1 hour and 40 minutes before the head ceased to respond. Brukhonenko considered it a success. He had shown, at least in principle, that the brain could be sustained outside the body, that death was not necessarily the instant, irreversible event it was believed to be, but rather a process, a sequence that could, under certain conditions, be paused or even reversed. In the years that followed, Brukhonenko refined his autojektor and performed additional experiments. He reportedly drained dogs entirely of their blood, waited several minutes, and then used his machine to resuscitate them. Some of these dogs, according to his notes, went on to live for years afterward, apparently healthy and normal. By 1940, a Soviet propaganda film titled Experiments in the Revival of Organisms was produced, ostensibly documenting Brukhonenko's work. The film showed, in graphic detail, a severed dog head hooked up to the machine, responding to stimuli in ways that appeared entirely conscious. The film was shown to audiences around the world and caused an uproar. Some viewers were horrified. Others were fascinated. The famous playwright George Bernard Shaw reportedly watched the film and remarked that he wished his own head could be preserved after death so that he could continue writing without the inconvenience of a body. But the authenticity of the film has been debated ever since its release. Some scientists and historians believe the footage was staged, or at least heavily embellished, that the head survived only minutes rather than the hours Brukhonenko claimed. Others point to the detailed scientific records and argue that even if the film exaggerated, the underlying science was real. What is not debated is the impact Brukhonenko's work had on the trajectory of modern medicine. His autojektor was the direct forerunner of the modern cardiopulmonary bypass machine, the device that allows surgeons today to operate on a patient's heart while a machine takes over the job of pumping and oxygenating their blood. Every open-heart surgery performed in the world today owes something to the crude device Brukhonenko built in a Moscow laboratory a century ago. He received the Lenin Prize posthumously in 1965 for his contributions to science, and his work laid the groundwork for an entire field of research into organ perfusion and resuscitation. But that recognition came with a cost that no one talked about at the time. The dogs that Brukhonenko used were strays pulled from the streets of Moscow, and their suffering was treated as an acceptable price for progress. There were no ethics boards reviewing his work, no committees weighing the cost of what he was doing against the potential benefits. There was only a man, a machine, and an endless supply of animals whose pain was recorded in meticulous detail, but never once questioned. And that same groundwork, laid in blood and institutional silence, also paved the way for others who would push Brukhonenko's ideas to even more disturbing extremes. One of those scientists was a man named Vladimir Demikhov, and if Brukhonenko had kept a dog's head alive on a table, Demikhov decided to go further. He didn't just want to sustain a head. He wanted to attach it to another living body. Demikhov was a Soviet surgeon who worked at the Moscow Institute of Surgery, and by the early 1950s, he had already made a name for himself as one of the most daring experimental surgeons in the world. He had performed the first successful coronary artery bypass surgery on a warm-blooded animal. He had transplanted lungs, livers, and hearts in dogs long before any human surgeon dared attempt the same. But the work that would make his name immortal, or perhaps infamous, began in 1954 and would continue for over a decade. Demikhov's most famous experiment involved taking a small puppy, removing most of its body while keeping its head, neck, shoulders, and front legs intact, and then grafting what remained onto the neck and upper body of a much larger dog, usually a German Shepherd. The result was a two-headed dog, a creature with two functioning brains, two sets of eyes, two mouths, and two personalities, all sharing a single circulatory system. The surgery itself took roughly 3.5 hours and required painstaking precision. Demikhov had to connect arteries, veins, and muscle tissue between the two animals in a way that allowed blood to flow to both heads without killing either one. The smaller head, the puppy's head, was connected to the larger dog's jugular vein and carotid artery, drawing its blood supply from the host animal's cardiovascular system. And astonishingly, it worked. Or at least, it appeared to. After the anesthesia wore off, both heads would wake up and begin to function independently. The larger dog would look around, confused, but alive. The smaller head mounted on the side of the larger dog's neck would do the same. Both heads could see, both could hear, both could smell, and both could attempt to eat, though the puppy's head had a particular problem. Because its esophagus wasn't connected to the larger dog's stomach, any food or water the puppy tried to swallow would simply flow out through a tube that dangled from the surgical site. Journalists who visited Demikhov's lab described watching the puppy head lap at a bowl of milk, only for the liquid to dribble right back out, a sight that was equal parts fascinating and deeply unsettling. The most famous of Demikhov's creations involved a dog named Brodyaga, a large mixed breed or German Shepherd, and a small puppy named Shavka. Photographs of the pair were published in newspapers and magazines around the world, and they became, for a brief time, among the most recognizable animals on the planet. In pictures, Shavka's small head can be seen perched on Brodyaga's neck, eyes open, tongue out, seemingly alert. Both heads would sometimes move in coordination, and other times they would act completely independently, as if unaware of the other's existence. Demikhov noted that the smaller head would occasionally become annoyed and nip at the larger dog's ear, and the larger dog would shake its head in irritation, unable to understand where the biting was coming from. But the experiments were never long-lived. Most of the two-headed dogs survived only days. Tissue rejection was the primary killer. The larger dog's immune system would eventually recognize the grafted head as foreign tissue and begin attacking it, leading to swelling, organ failure, and death. Demikhov's first attempt at the surgery in 1954 produced a two-headed dog that survived 4 days. His longest surviving creation lasted 29 days before succumbing to rejection. Over the course of more than a decade, Demikhov performed at least 23 of these transplants, each time refining his technique, each time buying a few more days of survival, and each time watching the creature he had built slowly die. The reaction to his work was polarized. In the West, Many scientists and journalists called him a madman, a butcher who tortured animals in the name of spectacle. In the Soviet Union, however, he was celebrated as a pioneer, a man who was pushing the boundaries of transplant surgery into territory no one else dared enter, and history, as it often does, proved the Soviets at least partially right. Demikhov's work on vascular surgery, organ transplantation, and tissue grafting directly influenced the field that would eventually produce the first successful human heart transplant. When Christian Barnard performed that historic surgery in Cape Town, South Africa, in December of 1967, he later acknowledged that Demikhov's work had been instrumental. Barnard had actually visited Demikhov's laboratory in Moscow and observed his techniques firsthand. Without Demikhov's two-headed dogs, the age of human organ transplantation might have been delayed by years, possibly decades. But for a neurosurgeon in Cleveland, Ohio, Demikhov's work wasn't just inspiring, it was a starting point. While Demikhov had attached one head to another body, this American doctor wanted to take the entire head of one creature and transplant it onto the body of another. His name was Robert White, and he believed that what he was doing could one day save human lives. To his critics, though, he was something else entirely. Robert White was a neurosurgeon at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, and by the late 1960s, he was one of the most skilled brain surgeons in the United States. He had performed thousands of operations, published extensively, and was a deeply religious man, a devout Catholic who served as an advisor to the Vatican on matters of bioethics. White believed that the brain was the seat of the soul, that a person's identity, personality, and consciousness resided entirely within the brain, and that the body was, in essence, a vehicle. This belief led him to a radical conclusion. If a person's body was failing, riddled with disease, or paralyzed beyond repair, why couldn't you simply give them a new one? Not a new organ, not a transplanted kidney or liver, but an entirely new body. And to prove that such a thing was possible, he would start with monkeys. In 1970, White performed his first full head transplant on a rhesus monkey. The procedure was extraordinarily complex. White and his team cooled the monkey's head to slow its metabolic rate, a technique called deep hypothermia, then carefully severed it from its body. They then connected the head to the body of a second monkey whose own head had been removed. The surgery required connecting arteries, veins, and ensuring that blood flow to the transplanted brain was restored as quickly as possible to prevent damage. White could not reconnect the spinal cord. No one could. The technology to fuse severed spinal nerves simply did not exist, and as of today, it still doesn't in any reliable form. This meant that even if the head survived, the monkey would be completely paralyzed from the neck down. When the anesthesia wore off, the monkey woke up. Its eyes opened. They tracked movement. When a member of White's team placed a finger near its mouth, the monkey attempted to bite. It could see, hear, smell, and taste. It was, by every observable metric, conscious and aware. But it could not move. It sat on its new body, alive and alert, trapped in a shell it could not command. The monkey survived for roughly 8 to 9 days before its immune system rejected the transplanted body, and the animal died. White repeated the experiment roughly 30 times over the following years, each time refining his surgical technique, each time achieving a conscious, alert monkey head on a paralyzed donor body. He called the procedure a body transplant rather than a head transplant, insisting that the body was being given to the head, not the other way around, because the head, in his view, was the person. The new body was just the life support system. He believed that one day the procedure could be performed on human beings, that a quadriplegic patient, already paralyzed, could be given a new body from a brain-dead donor. They would still be paralyzed, yes, but they would be alive, and their brain, their identity, would be preserved. The backlash was enormous. Animal rights groups, led by people for the ethical treatment of animals, targeted White relentlessly. They dubbed him Dr. Butcher and staged protests outside his hospital and home. White received death threats. His car was vandalized. Protesters followed his children to school, yet White remained unmoved. He continued his work, continued his advocacy, and continued to insist that what he was doing was not cruel, but compassionate. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 2004 and again in 2006, though he never received it. He died in 2010 at the age of 84, still believing that a human head transplant was not only possible, but inevitable, and that when it finally happened, the world would look back on his work not with horror, but with gratitude, recognizing him as the man who had the courage to go first. Now, if the idea of a head transplant feels extreme, the experiments we've discussed so far share something in common. They all had an arguably scientific purpose, even if the methods were grotesque. But the next experiment we are going to discuss is different, because the man who designed it wasn't trying to cure a disease or push the boundaries of surgery. He was trying to understand love, and in the process, he created one of the most psychologically devastating environments ever conceived, inside a laboratory. Harry Harlow was a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and in the late 1950s, he became famous for his work on maternal attachment in rhesus monkeys. His early experiments showed that infant monkeys, when given the choice between a wire surrogate mother that dispensed food and a soft cloth surrogate that provided no nourishment but could be clung to, overwhelmingly chose the cloth mother. The implication was profound. It suggested that love, comfort, and attachment were not merely byproducts of being fed, but fundamental biological needs, just as essential as food and water. The work was groundbreaking and earned Harlow widespread acclaim. But as the 1960s progressed and his personal life began to unravel, Harlow's work took a much darker turn. In 1968, he was hospitalized for depression. Then in 1971, his beloved wife, Margaret, died of cancer. Grief-stricken and newly fixated on the mechanics of despair, Harlow turned his attention away from love and towards its absence. He wanted to study depression, not as a clinical observation, but as something he could create, reliably and repeatedly, inside his laboratory. And so he built what he would come to call, with a frankness that disturbed even his colleagues, the pit of despair. The device was a vertical chamber, essentially a stainless steel well shaped like an inverted pyramid. The walls sloped inward, making it impossible for the monkey inside to climb out. The bottom was a mesh floor. There was no light, no companionship, no stimulation of any kind. It was, by design, a place of total sensory and social deprivation. Harlow took young monkeys, some as young as 3 months old, and lowered them into the pit, then left them there for weeks at a time, sometimes up to 10 weeks. He watched what happened. What happened was exactly what you might expect, and it was horrible. Within the first few days, most of the monkeys stopped moving. They huddled in the bottom of the chamber, arms wrapped around themselves, rocking back and forth. They refused food. They stopped vocalizing. Some of them began to harm themselves, pulling out their own hair, biting their own arms, and pressing their faces against the metal walls as if trying to disappear into them. When they were finally removed from the pit, the damage was catastrophic and in most cases, permanent. Monkeys that had been sociable and playful before entering the chamber emerged as hollow, trembling shells. They could not interact with other monkeys. They could not play. They could not parent. When paired with other monkeys, they either sat motionless in a corner or lashed out with unfocused, panicked aggression. Harlow noted that even monkeys who had been what he described as the happiest and most well-adjusted in his colony emerged from the pit profoundly changed. 30 days of isolation, he wrote, was sufficient to produce severe and lasting depressive behavior, and rather than viewing this as a reason to stop, Harlow saw it as a tool. He had successfully built a machine that manufactured despair, and he continued to use it. But the pit wasn't the only device Harlow created. He also built what he called the rape rack, a restraining device designed to hold female monkeys in place so they could be forcibly impregnated by males. The purpose was to study how mothers who had been raised in isolation, who had never experienced love or attachment themselves, would treat their own babies. The answer was grim. The isolation-reared mothers either ignored their infants entirely, sitting motionless while the babies screamed and clung to them, or they attacked them, biting and sometimes killing them. Harlow also created what he called the Iron Maiden, a surrogate mother made of cloth that could be triggered to suddenly blast the infant, clinging to it with compressed air or sharp metal spikes, studying how abuse affected the bond between mother and child. The answer, disturbingly, was that it strengthened it. The abused infants clung harder to the very source of their pain. Throughout all of this, Harlow displayed a detachment that unnerved even his supporters. In a 1974 interview, he stated plainly that he had no love for the monkeys, that he had never had any love for them, and that he despised cats and hated dogs, and he questioned how anyone could be expected to like a monkey. His work is widely credited as one of the primary catalysts for the modern animal rights movement, and the ethical backlash against his experiments helped lead to the establishment of institutional review boards and stricter regulations governing the use of animals in research. Harlow himself declined sharply in his later years, battling alcoholism, Parkinson's disease, and the lingering effects of his own depression, the very condition he had spent years trying to manufacture in his laboratory. He was stripped of his lab and gradually eased out of his position at Wisconsin. He died in 1981, largely isolated from the academic community that had once celebrated him as one of the greatest behavioral psychologists of the 20th century. The irony was not lost on those who knew him. The man who had built machines to create loneliness and despair ended his life consumed by both. And if the thought of deliberately manufacturing despair in animals feels difficult to reckon with, it becomes even more disturbing when you realize that similar experiments were being conducted on human beings at almost the exact same time, not in a university laboratory in Wisconsin, but in a mock prison built in the basement of a building at Stanford University. In the summer of 1971, a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo placed an advertisement in a Palo Alto newspaper seeking male college students willing to participate in a 2-week study of prison life for $15 a day. More than 70 young men applied. After psychological screenings designed to weed out anyone with emotional instability or a history of violence, Zimbardo selected 24 participants, all of them middle class, psychologically healthy, and with no criminal record. They were randomly divided into 2 groups. Half were designated as guards. The other half were designated as prisoners. None of them had any idea what was about to happen. On August 14, 1971, real Palo Alto police officers arrived at the homes of the 12 designated prisoners. They were arrested, handcuffed, read their rights, and transported to the Stanford campus, where the basement of Jordan Hall had been converted into a simulated prison. The prisoners were stripped, deloused with a spray, dressed in smocks with identification numbers printed on the front and back, had heavy chains placed on one ankle, and were fitted with tight nylon stocking caps to simulate the humiliation of having their heads shaved. Their names were taken away. From that point forward, they were referred to only by their assigned number. Every personal marker that connected them to their identity as a free individual was systematically removed, and in its place was the uniform anonymity of incarceration. They were marched into cells, 3 prisoners to a room barely large enough for 3 cots, and the heavy steel doors clanged shut behind them. The guards, meanwhile, were given khaki uniforms, mirrored sunglasses to prevent eye contact, wooden batons, and whistles. They were told to maintain order, but were given no specific instructions on how to do so. Zimbardo himself served as the superintendent of the prison, watching events unfold from a nearby room through hidden cameras and microphones. The idea was to observe what happened when ordinary people were placed into positions of absolute power or absolute powerlessness, and the answer came faster and more violently than anyone anticipated. By the second day, the prisoners attempted a rebellion, barricading themselves inside their cells using their beds. The guards, who up to that point had been somewhat restrained, responded with force. They stripped the prisoners, took away their beds, placed the ringleaders in solitary confinement, and began using physical exercise as punishment, forcing prisoners to do push-ups, sit-ups, and jumping jacks for hours. Bathroom privileges became a reward that had to be earned. Prisoners were forced to relieve themselves in buckets in their cells. Some guards began waking prisoners in the middle of the night for arbitrary roll calls and forced head counts that lasted hours. What disturbed Zimbardo most, at least in retrospect, was how quickly the participants stopped acting. Within 36 hours, one prisoner had a complete emotional breakdown, crying uncontrollably, screaming, and displaying what psychologists described as acute emotional disturbance. He was released from the study. Another prisoner developed a psychosomatic rash that spread across his entire body. Others became what observers described as zombie-like, shuffling through the halls with blank expressions, responding to orders mechanically, and showing no signs of independent thought or will. The guards, meanwhile, continued to escalate. Some of them devised punishments that had never been discussed or authorized. They forced prisoners to clean toilets with their bare hands. They invented degrading games and rituals. They singled out certain prisoners for constant harassment while rewarding others who complied without question. Not all of the guards behaved this way. In fact, roughly 2/3 of them remained relatively passive. But the remaining third, the ones who embraced the role most fully, drove the entire atmosphere of the prison into a place of genuine psychological cruelty. The experiment was supposed to last 14 days. It lasted 6. On the evening of August 19th, a visiting psychologist named Christina Maslach, who also happened to be Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time, arrived at the mock prison to observe. What she saw horrified her. She watched prisoners being marched to the bathroom with bags over their heads, guards barking orders, and young men who had been psychologically healthy less than a week earlier reduced to trembling, obedient shadows of themselves. She confronted Zimbardo that night and told him that what he was doing to those boys was terrible. Of the roughly 50 people who had observed the experiment at various points, she was the only one who objected. Zimbardo ended the study the next morning. In the decades since, the Stanford Prison Experiment has become one of the most famous and most debated studies in the history of psychology. It has been taught in classrooms around the world as evidence of the power of situational forces, proof that ordinary people can commit acts of cruelty when placed in the right circumstances. But it has also been challenged aggressively. In 2018, a French researcher named Thibault Letexier published a book titled Histoire d'un mensonge, or History of a Lie, in which he argued that the experiment was far more orchestrated than Zimbardo had let on. Letexier presented evidence that at least some of the guards had been coached to behave harshly, that Zimbardo himself had intervened to encourage abusive behavior when it flagged, and that some participants later admitted they had been performing rather than genuinely losing themselves in their roles. Whether the experiment revealed a deep truth about human nature, or was, as Letexier argued, a kind of theater designed to produce a predetermined outcome, remains a matter of active and sometimes heated debate. But whatever one makes of the Stanford experiment, it was at least confined to a university basement and lasted less than a week. The next program we are going to explore operated in total secrecy, lasted 20 years, and was run not by a psychology professor, but by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. In April of 1953, a CIA chemist named Sidney Gottlieb launched a program so classified that even most senior government officials didn't know it existed. It was called MKUltra, and its purpose was as ambitious as it was terrifying. The CIA wanted to discover whether it was possible to control the human mind, not influence it, not persuade it, but control it entirely to take a person and through drugs, torture, hypnosis, or some combination of all three, bend their will until they became a programmable instrument. The backdrop was the Cold War. American intelligence agencies were convinced that the Soviet Union and China had already developed techniques for brainwashing prisoners of war, and the United States was determined not to fall behind. MKUltra was the answer, and over the course of its existence, it would grow into one of the largest and most disturbing covert programs in American history. The program eventually encompassed at least 149 separate sub-projects conducted at universities, hospitals, prisons, and CIA safe houses across the United States and Canada. The methods employed ranged from the merely unethical to the genuinely nightmarish. Researchers administered LSD, mescaline, heroin, barbiturates, methamphetamine, and dozens of other substances to subjects, many of whom had no idea they were being experimented on. They were dosed at parties, in bars, in hospitals, and in interrogation rooms. Some were volunteers, many were not. One of the most disturbing sub-projects was run by a doctor named Harris Isbell at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, an institution that was ostensibly a treatment facility for drug addicts, but in reality served as a convenient source of captive human subjects. Isbell administered LSD to 7 African-American men for 77 consecutive days. When the men developed a tolerance to the drug, Isbell didn't stop. He increased the dose, eventually administering quadruple the original amount. His clinical notes describe the men experiencing extended hallucinations, severe paranoia, and prolonged psychological breakdowns. Yet, at no point did Isbell consider ending the experiment. He treated their deterioration as data points rather than warning signs. The men were technically volunteers, but the nature of their volunteering was dubious at best. They were incarcerated addicts being held in a federal facility, and in exchange for participating in the experiments, they were given their drug of choice as payment. It was a transaction that exploited the most vulnerable people in the most vulnerable circumstances, coercion dressed in the thin clothes of consent, and it continued for months without a single person in authority raising a concern. Then there was Operation Midnight Climax, a sub-project so bizarre it sounds like fiction. The CIA set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York City, decorated them to look like the apartments of wealthy bohemians, and staffed them with prostitutes who were on the CIA's payroll. The prostitutes would lure men back to the apartments, where their drinks would be secretly dosed with LSD. Behind two-way mirrors, CIA agents watched and recorded everything that happened, studying how the drug affected behavior, suggestibility, and sexual performance. The men had no idea they were being observed. They had no idea they had been drugged. Some of them experienced severe psychological episodes and left the apartments in states of terror and confusion, never knowing what had been done to them. But perhaps the most tragic individual case to emerge from MKUltra was that of Frank Olson. Olson was an Army biochemist who worked on biological weapons research at Fort Detrick in Maryland. On November 19, 1953, Olson attended a retreat at a CIA facility at Deep Creek Lodge in rural Maryland, where, without his knowledge or consent, his drink was spiked with LSD by Sidney Gottlieb himself. Over the following days, Olson's behavior changed dramatically. He became paranoid, agitated, and deeply depressed. He told colleagues he had made a terrible mistake and that he wanted out. 9 days later, on November 28th, Olson fell from the 10th floor window of the Hotel Statler in New York City. The CIA initially called it a suicide. For 22 years, that was the official story. Then, in 1975, the Rockefeller Commission, a presidential investigation into CIA abuses, revealed for the first time that Olson had been dosed with LSD without his consent. The Olson family was invited to the White House, where President Gerald Ford personally apologized. CIA Director William Colby expressed his regrets. The family received a settlement of $750,000. But Frank's son, Eric Olson, never believed the suicide story. In 1994, he had his father's body exhumed and examined by a forensic pathologist who found a previously undetected cranial injury, a blow to the head that was inconsistent with a fall and consistent with having been struck before going through the window. The medical examiner changed the manner of death to homicide. To this day, no one has been charged. In 1973, as Watergate was consuming the Nixon administration and congressional investigations into intelligence abuses were ramping up, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. The vast majority were burned. But by sheer bureaucratic accident, roughly 20,000 pages survived. They had been misfiled in the CIA's financial records rather than its operational archives, and when investigators went looking for MKUltra documents in 1977, they found them. Those pages revealed only a fraction of the program's full scope, but what they contained was enough to shock the nation. Senate hearings followed, apologies were issued, regulations were tightened. But by then, the damage was done, not just to the individuals who had been experimented on, but to the public's trust in its own government. MKUltra proved that the line between protector and predator could be crossed without a second thought, and that the people tasked with keeping a nation safe were capable of inflicting some of the worst harm imaginable. And if MKUltra represents the darkest chapter of American intelligence experimentation, then what happened across the Pacific Ocean during the Second World War represents something that goes beyond darkness entirely. Because what took place in a compound outside the city of Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria wasn't just unethical science, it was industrialized atrocity, and its scale remains almost incomprehensible. In 1936, the Imperial Japanese Army established a sprawling research facility in the Pingfang district of Harbin, China. It consisted of more than 150 buildings, complete with laboratories, operating rooms, holding cells, crematoria, and an airfield. The facility was surrounded by a high-voltage electric fence and patrolled by armed guards. To the outside world, it was known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Internally, it was known as Unit 731, and it was commanded by a military physician named General Shiro Ishii. Ishii was a brilliant and ambitious man who believed that biological warfare was the future of military strategy. He convinced Japanese high command that an investment in biological weapons research would give Japan an insurmountable advantage, and to develop those weapons, he needed test subjects, not animals, humans. Over the next 9 years, an estimated 3,000 to 12,000 men, women, and children would be brought through the gates of Unit 731 and subjected to experiments that defy comprehension. The prisoners were Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, Russian, and from various other nationalities. Internally, they were never referred to as people. They were called marutas, the Japanese word for logs, a code name derived from the cover story that the facility was a lumber mill. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 were designed not to advance medicine, but to advance warfare, and they were carried out with a clinical efficiency that is difficult to reconcile with the sheer barbarity of what was being done. Prisoners were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, and dozens of other diseases. They were then monitored as the diseases progressed through their bodies, and at various stages, they were vivisected, cut open while still alive and fully conscious, without anesthesia, so that researchers could observe the effects of the disease on living organs in real time. Anesthesia was not used because Ishii and his staff believed it might distort the results. Other experiments had nothing to do with disease. Prisoners were subjected to frostbite testing, their arms submerged in freezing water until the flesh froze solid. Researchers would then strike the frozen limbs with sticks, and when the limbs produced a sound that one survivor described as resembling a board striking wood, the tissue was considered fully frozen. The researchers would then attempt various methods of thawing, from hot water to open flame, documenting the damage at every stage. Prisoners were placed inside pressure chambers and subjected to increasing atmospheric pressure until their eyes literally popped from their sockets. Others were hung upside down to see how long it took them to die. Some were deprived of food and water to determine the limits of human endurance. Some were spun in centrifuges. Some were injected with animal blood. Some were exposed to lethal doses of radiation. Women who were held at the facility were forcibly impregnated and then subjected to the same experiments as other prisoners, including vivisection while pregnant, so that researchers could observe the effects of disease and trauma on fetal development. There was no pretense of science in the way the word is normally understood. There was only the methodical destruction of human beings in the pursuit of data. But Unit 731 was not merely a laboratory. It was also a weapons factory. Ishii developed methods for delivering biological agents on a massive scale. His team created ceramic bombs filled with plague-infected fleas that could be dropped from aircraft over populated areas. They contaminated water supplies and food stores with cholera and typhoid in field tests conducted over Chinese cities, including Changde, Ningbo, and Kuju. These biological weapons were deployed against civilian populations, resulting in estimated death tolls in the tens of thousands. The plague outbreaks that followed some of these attacks continued to kill people for years after the initial deployment. When the war ended in August of 1945, Ishii ordered the destruction of all evidence. Buildings were demolished. Documents were burned. The remaining 400 or so prisoners still held at the facility were executed. And in a final act of recklessness, infected laboratory animals were released into the surrounding countryside. The resulting plague outbreaks are estimated to have killed an additional 30,000 Chinese civilians. But perhaps the most disturbing part of Unit 731's story is what happened after the war. When American forces learned of the biological weapons research conducted at Pingfang, they faced a choice. They could prosecute Ishii and his colleagues for war crimes, or they could acquire the data for themselves. They chose the latter. In exchange for full access to Unit 731's research findings, the United States granted Ishii and his staff complete immunity from prosecution. None of them were tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Ishii lived freely in Japan until his death from throat cancer in 1959. Many of his researchers went on to hold senior positions in Japanese medicine, academia, and government. Some became university deans. Others led pharmaceutical companies. One reportedly became the head of a major Japanese medical school. The data they had gathered through the torture and murder of thousands of human beings was quietly absorbed into American military research, classified and stored away. Japan did not formally acknowledge the existence of Unit 731 until 2002, and a full and comprehensive government apology has never been issued. Survivors and their descendants have filed lawsuits in Japanese courts, but each has been dismissed. The story of Unit 731 is, in many ways, the story of what happens when the pursuit of knowledge is married to unchecked power and shielded by political convenience, and the silence that followed was perhaps the cruelest experiment of all. Now, everything we've discussed tonight took place decades ago, in an era when ethical oversight was lax or non-existent, when governments operated in shadow and accountability was an afterthought. You might assume that in our modern world, with its institutional ethics boards, rigorous regulatory frameworks, multi-stage informed consent protocols, and decades of hard-won lessons from the very experiments we've discussed tonight, something like this could never happen again. The safeguards were supposed to prevent it. The systems were supposed to catch it. And yet, on a quiet Monday morning in March of 2006, in a clinical research unit at Northwick Park Hospital in northwest London, the modern age got its own brutal reminder that science can still go terribly, catastrophically wrong, and that all the safeguards in the world can fail when the gap between animal biology and human biology is wider than anyone expects. The drug was called TGN1412. It was a monoclonal antibody, a type of laboratory-created molecule designed to target specific cells in the immune system, and it had been developed by a small German pharmaceutical company called Tegenero. The drug was intended to treat autoimmune diseases and certain types of leukemia by modulating the body's immune response, essentially dialing down the immune system's tendency to attack the body's own tissues. In animal testing, TGN1412 had shown promising results. It appeared safe, effective, and well tolerated, even at doses far higher than what would be given to humans. Based on those results, the drug was approved for a Phase 1 clinical trial, the first stage of testing in human subjects, designed primarily to assess safety. On the morning of March 13, 2006, 8 healthy young men reported to the Parexel Clinical Research Facility at Northwick Park Hospital. They were volunteers, recruited through advertisements, and they had signed consent forms acknowledging the risks involved in being the first human beings to receive an experimental drug. 6 of them would receive TGN1412. 2 would receive a placebo. The dose administered was 0.1 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, roughly 500 times lower than the dose that had been safely administered to laboratory animals. It should have been, by every available measure, a safe and unremarkable morning. It was anything but. The drug was administered intravenously, and each of the 6 men received their dose within a span of approximately 10 minutes, a decision that would later be heavily criticized. In animal trials, the drug had been administered much more slowly, but here, in the interest of efficiency, the doses were given in rapid succession. Within 60 minutes, every single one of the 6 men who received TGN1412 began to deteriorate. It started with headaches and nausea, then escalated into something far worse. The men's bodies were experiencing what immunologists call a cytokine storm, a catastrophic overreaction of the immune system in which the body essentially turns on itself. White blood cells flooded the bloodstream, releasing enormous quantities of inflammatory molecules. Organs began to fail. Blood pressure plummeted. Temperature spiked. Within hours, all 6 men were in intensive care. Their heads and necks swelled to grotesque proportions, a symptom so striking that the British tabloid press seized on it immediately and dubbed the incident the Elephant Man drug trial. One of the volunteers, a young man named Ryan Wilson, suffered the most severe reaction. He spent 4 months in the hospital, his fingers starved of blood by the catastrophic inflammatory response, turned black and had to be amputated. He lost portions of his toes and part of one foot to dry gangrene. The other 5 volunteers also suffered permanent injuries, including organ damage, and dramatically increased lifetime risks of cancer and autoimmune disease, the very conditions the drug had been designed to treat. The investigation that followed revealed a cascade of failures. The dose, while low relative to animal studies, had been given to all 6 men within minutes of each other, rather than staggering the doses and waiting to observe any adverse reactions in the first volunteer before dosing the next. This meant that by the time the first signs of trouble appeared, all 6 men had already received the drug, and there was no way to undo it. Additionally, researchers had failed to account for the fact that the human immune system responds to TGN1412 in a fundamentally different way than the immune systems of the laboratory animals in which it had been tested. The drug bound to a receptor that, in monkeys, produced a mild immune response. In humans, it triggered a massive, uncontrolled immune activation that nearly killed everyone who received it. Tegenero, the company behind TGN1412, went bankrupt. The volunteers received a settlement that was widely criticized as inadequate, reportedly totaling around $925,000 spread among the 6 men, drawn from an insurance policy that capped at $2 million. In the aftermath, Britain's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency issued 22 new recommendations for the conduct of first-in-human drug trials, including staggered dosing, longer observation periods, and stricter criteria for translating animal data to human dosing. The TGN1412 disaster became a landmark case in pharmacology, a case study taught in medical schools around the world as a reminder that the gap between animal biology and human biology can be a chasm, and that stepping across it carelessly can end in catastrophe. And so here we are, at the end of a long and difficult journey through some of the most disturbing experiments ever conducted. From the orphanage in Davenport, where children were told they were broken, to a laboratory in Moscow, where a dog's severed head blinked on a table, to a hospital in London, where healthy young men were brought to the edge of death by a drug that was supposed to help people, the common thread is the same. In every case, the pursuit of knowledge came at a cost that no amount of data could justify. These stories remind us that science without conscience is not progress. It is simply power unchecked. And the monsters that emerged from these experiments were never the creatures in the lab. They were the people who built the cages. If you found this video interesting, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps more than you know, and I deeply appreciate each and every one of you for listening. Until next time, sleep well.